so that it now is used as a form of foreplay by couples and has taken its place, if you will, in the mainstream of America.
Nonetheless, sexually explicit material, along with prostitution, is very upsetting to many Americans who are deeply concerned about what they see as the moral decay of U.S. society.
A lot of the way I see it playing out is in direct battles, political battles between movements, basically. A conservative religious right movement who, you have to sort of root out the sexuality in order to suppress it. There's still that dynamic there, but mainly what they want to do is make sure that young people are not exposed to sexual content in the culture, that when there is sexual revelation of any kind, that it is denounced, and so on. And so I think some of it's just this country is so divided, and this is an area that carries a lot of the divisions.
U.S. attitudes about sexuality are by no means universal. In fact, in many societies, the subject of sex generates little or no controversy.
The Scandinavian societies, Sweden, Denmark, they have always had a basis of openness and of equality, both male and female. And this kind of non-discrimination in the gender side was also carried over to the sexual side. They started sex education in kindergarten. They felt that sex was something to be honored in the relationship. It didn't require marriage to be part of the relationship, but simply a commitment to the relationship. And so what we see is a greater freedom there and a greater commitment to not just sexuality, but to relationships in general. Now we could go to another society in a different sphere altogether. We could go to India and looking at the basis in Hinduism as opposed to the Judeo-Christian ethic. The Hindu philosophy about sexuality was one that sexuality was an integral part of your religion, was an integral part of your spirituality, and that you could reach spiritual fulfillment through your sexual relationship.
We have a bit of a double standard when it comes to sexuality. On the one hand, we are taught from a really young age to be embarrassed about our sexuality. We're taught that perhaps, parts of the body aren't mentioned, or masturbation is bad, and so we're taught to kind of be ashamed maybe about our sexuality. On the other hand, we're living in a society where sex sells everything from cars to iced tea, and so we have a lot of mixed messages about sexuality.
The U.S. society on sexuality is probably a bit schizophrenic. If we want to take a look, it comes out of the Judeo-Christian ethic, and that goes all the way back to the Roman times. During that period, Christianity was more anti-sexual than sexual. And so we saw early Christianity having a very negative view of sexuality. In fact, equating sexuality with sin.
After religion, we have other major institutions like medicine, the law, education, that have all come together and have kind of reinforced attitudes about what is considered to be normal sexuality, and then the agenda gets set.
But while that agenda may be set, it is subject to change over time.
Society's never linear, and that has a lot to do with the political situation, has a lot to do with the way society is moving.
As you look back in history, we've been through cycles of sexual repression and sexual permissiveness, and one of the most interesting cycles was prior to the Victorian era. It was a fairly libertine time sexually, and then suddenly you had Queen Victoria and all her allies coming along and developing a much more sexually restrictive system.
What I would say is that while we've had a history based around more of a repressive view, we also have had times in which people have broken out. In the 20s, we saw it again in the 60s. And those were two times when we saw, if you will, rather very expressive sexual behaviors and sexuality. One of the reasons for the 60s was that there was a culmination of a number of things that occurred in the 60s. With women's liberation, with the president, with Kennedy, with the openness, with the civil rights, sexuality blossomed.
In the early 1970s, with the Roe v. Wade decision that made abortion legal, That blossoming trend seemed to continue. But by the 1980s, with the election of Ronald Reagan and the rise of the Christian right, United States attitudes about sexuality turned decidedly mixed once again. And so the battle was joined between those attempting to break down barriers pertaining to sexual expression and those seeking a return to so-called traditional family values. In the years since, this debate has frequently focused on the subject of sexual orientation and the possible causes of homosexuality.
Many people who are profoundly, for religious and cultural reasons, opposed to homosexuality think it's a question of choice, somehow or other disregarding the obvious fact that to be different in our culture, particularly to be sexually different, to be homosexual in a homophobic culture, subjects you to all kinds of discrimination and vilification and self-loathing and self-doubt. Why in the world anybody would choose that escapes my reasoning.
There continue to be debates about what causes somebody to be gay, lesbian, or bisexual. And I think we need to be very careful about that kind of language, what causes or what determines somebody's sexuality. Because often behind that question is what went wrong.
When we begin to talk about sexual orientation, it's interesting, we never ask why people are heterosexual. We only ask why they have an orientation other than heterosexuality.
And I think that we need to ask ourselves the question, why are we even asking the question? Because to what end, in the service of what, will the answer be? Why are we asking the question?
It's a matter of which category gets marked as the deviant one, which one is problematized. So I think that the question of why someone is gay is reflective of a larger homophobic attitude.
But that question will continue to have relevance so long as civil rights laws that protect against discrimination turn in part on whether one's status is inborn or chosen.
We have a very interesting thing when we take a look at the question of a minority status. Because minority status is this innate characteristic: sex, being female, race, color. Now when we take those, the person has no choice, and so we say that, gee, then they belong to a minority and they get minority status. Now when we talk about sexual preference, we don't have the same position, because the position that's taken in the country is, well, this could be by choice, therefore it does not get minority status. The gay and lesbian community has had to fight state by state to get statutes passed that do not allow discrimination based on the fact that this may be by choice and not by birth.
The more mainstream members of the gay rights movement will take issue with this idea, arguing that one's orientation is inborn rather than chosen, and that, as a result, gay individuals should be protected by federal law against discrimination.
On the other hand, more progressive components in the gay rights movement say we should not have to say we're born gay, we can't help it. They say there's actually something problematic with arguing a standpoint which says, like us anyway, we can't help it. We shouldn't have to prove that there's a gay gene, for example, in order to get equal rights. Because, for example, we protect people on the basis of religion. We say that you cannot be discriminated against because you're Catholic or Jewish or Muslim.